So this is a presentation about PFAS, which I'm sure that many of us have, started to hear more and more about. This is intended to be kind of just a educational presentation for people that might not, know a lot about it or are curious about it. We're kind of going to talk about, what is PFAS? Has it been used for? How does it get into the environment? We're going to talk about things that the federal and state governments are doing to try to get this under control. And at the end, we can kind of talk about, what things that you might be able to do if you're concerned about your exposure to PFAS. And you should feel free to, interrupt me at any time if you have any questions or if you want to talk through something or hoping to have a little bit of a discussion at the end as well. So my name is Will. I'm an environmental consultant. I work for an environmental law firm. And honestly, the past few years, PFAS has been kind of a major part of what I've been dealing with. It's a big issue. So let's dive right in. So what are PFAS? The acronym stands for per and poly-fluoroalkyl substances. And just kind of want to break that down, right? So these are substances. These are not naturally occurring. These are, synthetic chemicals that are created by man. They've been around since about the 50s or 60s is when they started, really going into commercial use. And there's been kind of a lot of public concern about their toxicity that the government is trying to respond to now. Alkyl is a chemistry term that means basically a chain of carbon atoms that are all connected by single bonds, right? So these are two examples of octane, which is an alkane, but they have slightly different structures, right? So it's called octane because it has 8 carbons, and they may be arranged in a linear fashion, like the top one here, or they might be branched, right? But they're both octane. Those are examples of two isomers. There's the 8 carbons there. Fluoro just means that all of these hydrogens that are connected to the carbon sort of backbone have been replaced by fluorine atoms. Shown in green here. So this is an example of a PFAS molecule called PFOA that stands for perfluorooctanoic acid, right? Again, it has 8 carbons. That's where the octo comes from. This is perfluorinated, which means that every available carbon has been completely saturated with fluorines. You can see that. And it's an acid. So on the right end here, we have a carboxylic acid. So again, perfluorooctanoic acid. There's the acid group. This is another example of a PFAS molecule. This one is perfluorinated, right? Because you can see there's 2 carbons here that are not fully saturated with fluorine. So there are, many, many different types of PFAS. In fact, there's, at this point, I think we know about over 12,000 individual chemicals, but they're all lumped into this class because they sort of behave similarly and have similar chemistry. So we can sort of break these things into categories based on their chemistry, right? So again, I think we're up beyond 12,000 individual PFAS molecules at this point. They can be put into categories like the perfluoroalkyl acids. That's kind of what I just showed you, right? The perfluorocarboxylic acids, sulfonic acids, phosphoric acids. They have different chain lengths, right? So on the last slide, we looked at ones that had 8 carbons, the octanoics, but they can be as small as 4 carbons, and they can be as long as, 20. And again, each one of those carbon backbones can be linear or it can take on a number of branched configurations. So this is just sort of an example of how these things are categorized differently. I mentioned they can have different sort of polar groups, right? So that's the acid sort of tail on the end of the molecule, and there's different acids provide different chemistry and different characteristics in the environment. I mentioned that there's different isomers, branched versus linear. And then we're seeing, some of we call these replacement PFAS because when manufacturers started to learn about some of the toxicity of the original ones that they had invented, they started coming out with what they called replacement PFAS. You may have heard of one called Gen-X before. And, they have just essentially slightly modified the chemistry in an effort to make them less toxic, although, as we're learning now, they still have some toxicity. So how do these things behave in the environment? Well, they have a wide range of characteristics, right? Depending on the acid functional group, um, they can travel very far and very fast in the environment, or some of them are, especially the longer carbon chains, once you get up to 10, 11, 12 carbons, they tend to move a little slower. But generally, compared to other contaminants, like things that you'd find in, say, for example, a petroleum spill, these are highly mobile. So once they are released into the environment, they tend to spread very far and very quickly compared to other things, which is a problem. The carbon fluorine bond is the strongest covalent bond that is possible in chemistry, and there are no environmental mechanisms to break that bond. And so what that means is these chemicals really don't break down once they're into the environment. The only way that we know currently to destroy them is by incineration at very, very high temperatures, right? But unlike, again, like say a gasoline spill, which eventually will break down in the environment, these do not. So that's why you may have heard the term forever chemicals thrown around. That's where this comes from, because once they're released, they just stay in the environment. They move around, between the groundwater, the surface water, and the atmosphere, and they just become pervasive in our environment. They also, I mentioned they don't break down. So what that means is they tend to bioaccumulate, right? Once they get into the food chain, they just get concentrated as you move up the food chain. So that's a problem. And that's part of the reason why the drinking water standards and cleanup standards for these chemicals have been set very, very, very low. It's because of that bioaccumulative nature. You can think of something like for mercury, for example, right? If you eat too much sushi, you might get a little too much mercury in your diet. The same is true with PFAS. They can transform in the environment. So, for example, this is the molecule I showed earlier on the first slide. You'll notice that these two carbons here on the end are not completely fluorinated, and so that part of the molecule can be broken down by various microbes and things in the environment. But all that's doing is just turning it into another PFAS. So they may sort of change forms, but they never truly disappear. Where do these things come from? How do they get into the environment? Well, they've been used for a long time in industry and manufacturing. Again, that sort of fluorinated chain of carbons. Not to get too deep into the chemistry, but it is a very non-polar group. And then you have the acid tail on the other end that is highly polar, right? And we call those surfactants, molecules that behave in that way and function that way. They're used as surfactants. So an example that you can think of is like your dish detergent at home, right? When you have, normally oil and water don't like to mix, but you put a drop of dish detergent in there and it instantly sort of breaks that emulsion and makes the two things mix together. And it's very good, for cleaning your dishes. These chemicals sort of behave in the same way, although they are thousands and thousands of times more powerful as surfactants than dish detergent. But that gives them a lot of, really useful uses in industry, and that's why they've been used. They're used as processing aids in the manufacture of polymers like Teflon, PTFE. They're used as surfactants in certain industrial applications. They also make very good wetting agents, right? So if you have, say, like a paint or a coating, and you want to make sure you get really quick, even coverage of a surface, well, that might have a small amount of PFAS added into it, to accelerate that coverage effect. These were also used as mist suppressants for a long time in certain industries like chrome plating. In fact, the EPA for a long time mandated the use of these chemicals because that was the best way to control air emissions from a chrome plating bath. You make a nice layer of foam over the bath, and then your chrome doesn't go into the air and leave the facility. And I mentioned surface coatings. The other thing that they're really useful for is making things oil and water repellent. Um, so they're used extensively in textiles, carpets, furniture, anything, like think like your Scotch guard that you would put on your shoes. Those are very common sources of PFAS. They're also used extensively in food packaging, right? So if you go to McDonald's and you buy a Big Mac, it comes in that sort of cardboard container that has that waxy film on the outside. I mean, that's there so you don't get grease on your fingers and on your clothes, but that coating has PFAS in it. They're also used in some cosmetics and personal care products, cleaners, pesticides, again, for that sort of wetting effect, right? If you're spraying pesticide, you want it to cover the crop. So those are other sources of PFAS that we're aware of. And once these things get into the environment, again, they don't break down, so they end up sort of being collected and concentrated in wastewater treatment plants, right? Whatever goes down the drain into the sewer ends up in the wastewater treatment plant. And similarly at landfills, right? Your landfills are kind of collecting all of these sort of products and industrial chemicals. The landfill itself is not using PFAS, but it is sort of collecting all those materials and concentrating it. So wastewater treatment plants and landfills are sometimes called passive receivers, meaning, again, they're not making this stuff, they're not using it, but they are sources of it because they're collecting it from everybody else. And in the wastewater treatment process, they're removing contaminants from the sewage, and what you end up with from the wastewater treatment process is what's called biosolids, right? You end up with this sludge that is then digested, and that stuff makes really, really, really good fertilizer. And so for a long time, and to this day, the use of sewage or the use of biosolids as a replacement for fertilizer was seen as a really good thing. It's a form of recycling, right? It reduces our use of new chemicals to make new fertilizer. But what ends up happening is the PFAS that gets into the wastewater treatment plant, it gets concentrated in these biosolids, which are then sent out to farms and applied to the land. It rains on the land. The PFAS end up in the groundwater. So that's a huge problem that we're trying to figure out right now. And then another sort of major source of PFAS is in firefighting foams. Again, if you think about dish detergent, right, it's very good at making bubbles and foams. So if you have a fire of a volatile chemical like jet fuel or something like that, you generally don't want to use water to try to put out a fire like that. What you want to use is foam. And for a long time, these aqueous film forming foams, or AFFF as it's called, they are just chock full of PFAS, because the PFAS, due to their surfactant nature, they make really, really strong, durable foams that are able to quickly extinguish a fire. And in fact, the FAA, they have standards for firefighting foams and what is supposed to be used at airports, and they also required the use of these foams for a long time. So that's sort of the major sources of PFAS and how they get into the environment and how we end up being exposed to them. So the toxicity of PFAS, this is sort of an area of active and intense research that's going on right now. We're learning more and more about these chemicals every day and kind of what they do to our bodies. But it's, dietary exposure is the main human exposure pathway. So that means you're ingesting it somehow. It's either in the water that you're drinking or, in the food that you're eating. And as I mentioned, because our bodies are not really able to break these chemicals down, they bioaccumulate. And in fact, there's been studies done where they have sampled, people's blood across the country, and they found it in 98% of Americans' blood. So the odds are that, it's in us now. It's been detected in breast milk and umbilical cord blood, and there are some indications of developmental toxicity for newborns, which is extremely concerning. Um, and it again is part of the reason that the drinking water standards and the cleanup standards for these chemicals are so unbelievably low. It's because your body, can't break them down. It just accumulates over time. Um, the first sort of like seminal study of PFAS toxicity was in Parkersburg, West Virginia. This was around a facility that was manufacturing PFOA and had substantial PFOA emissions to the air. And they sampled 69,000 individuals and noticed that the people that worked in this plant and lived around the plant had much higher incidence of high cholesterol, uh, inflammatory bowel disease, thyroid disease, testicular cancer, kidney cancer, as well, and pregnancy-induced hypertension. And as I mentioned, EPA and other researchers and toxicologists are studying these things right now, trying to understand the dose response relationship, right? We're trying to figure out if there is a safe level of these chemicals that we can be exposed to. And so the way they need to do that, well, the way that that is typically done is with animal studies, right? Where you have sort of a large number of rats, and you're dosing the rats with PFAS, and then you're sort of measuring the different effects. And that allows you to quantify the dose response relationship, right? Like how much can you ingest and not have an effect? That's what these researchers are really trying to figure out right now. Um, some of the outcomes that they're observing, again, there's low infant birth weights, incredibly concerning, immunosuppressive effects, changes in liver enzymes, kidney damage. Um, but this is, as I mentioned, this is still an area of active research. There's a lot of uncertainty in these studies right now. And so what EPA and other regulators will do is when they have a situation where, the scientific literature has a lot of uncertainty, they they apply conservative factors like safety factors, right? And rightly so. Um, and so that is also part of the reason why the drinking water standards for these chemicals are so low, is because we're still working on figuring this out. Many of the drinking water standards are in the single digit parts per trillion range. Um, so like 4 parts per trillion. And just to give you kind of a sense of how low a concentration that is, that's like one drop in an Olympic sized swimming pool. So, and again, because the standards are so low, uh, EPA and other scientists have had to develop new analytical methods to look for these things. Our typical instrumentation that we use to study these chemicals wasn't able to get down to that low a concentration. And so there's been a lot of active research in that field as well, just figuring out, how can we sample for these things? What instrumentation can we use to get down below, 1 or 2 parts per trillion? Um, so the federal government, especially during the last administration, has been very active in promulgating PFAS regulations. Um, the first regulation was back in 2012, and this was part of the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. So this is every 5 years, EPA publishes a list of chemicals that they are interested in, basically that they are considering regulating. And so they asked public water suppliers, the big drinking water plants, to start sampling for these chemicals so they can determine how prevalent they are in the nation's drinking water supply and at what levels, right? And then once they have collected all of that data, they can start making decisions on whether or not that we need to regulate these things. So PFOA and PFOS, 2 of the 12,000 PFAS molecules were part of UCMR3 that was back in 2012. But the analytical methods that were available at that time really weren't able to get down to what we think is the safe concentration, again, single digit parts per trillion, which is extremely low. And so if you look at that UCMR3 data set, you really don't see too much, right? Because in all likelihood, the PFAS was there, but we just weren't able to detect it back in 2012. More recently, in 2020, the National Defense Authorization Act required EPA to keep adding new PFAS chemicals to what's called the TRI list, or the Toxics Release Inventory list. So this is a list of chemicals that industrial facilities are required to report if they are manufacturing them, processing them, or using them above certain quantities. So again, this is more of a data collection exercise where EPA is trying to understand who's using this stuff in industry and where and in what volumes. 2021 was when UCMR5 was announced, and that is kind of the sampling for this monitoring rule is kind of happening right now across the nation. So in UCMR5, EPA added, I want to say it's 29 PFAS. Again, none of these chemicals at that time were regulated in drinking water, but EPA was trying to understand where they were. And so they told all the public water suppliers, you need to start monitoring for these things. And now we have an analytical method that can go down to that low of a concentration. So our drinking water plants are doing that now. They're actively doing that monitoring right now. September 2023, reporting rule was created under TSCA. This is the Toxic Substances Control Act. This act has more to do with the registration of new chemicals. Like if you invent a new chemical process, or you want to manufacture and sell a new chemical, TSCA says that you need to register it with the federal government, and you need to describe, how that chemical is going to be used, both in industry and in commerce, and what the hazards of it are. So again, more sort of data collection efforts. EPA is trying to understand, again, who's using these chemicals, how many of them are there out there, and where are they being used. In 2023 and 2024, certain PFAS molecules were designated as hazardous constituents under RCRA. RCRA is kind of the hazardous waste regulation that determines, what wastes need to be handled more carefully than others. And so PFAS is not, these are not a hazardous waste right now, but this is kind of the first step in designating, PFAS waste streams as hazardous, which will require them, to be disposed at certain locations across the country, only, permitted hazardous waste disposal facilities instead of normal landfills. And it requires tracking of all those shipments, essentially from when it is generated to when it is ultimately disposed. And then in April of last year, the federal drinking water standards for 5 PFAS were listed. So there are now, federal safe drinking water standards for a handful of PFAS, the big ones, PFOA, PFOS, the ones that are most well studied and most commonly used. So although that law was passed in April 2024, the actual drinking water limits do not take effect until 2029. And the reason for that is, EPA recognizes that many of our public water suppliers are going to need to upgrade their facilities and install, new treatment systems in order to remove this stuff from our drinking water. And so there's sort of a phased approach of when those standards would take effect. So by 2027, all of the drinking water suppliers in the country will have had to do their initial monitoring. And then at that point, they will be required to notify their customers if they have PFAS above the safe drinking water standards. And then by 2029, they will have to comply with those standards. In July of last year, PFOA and PFOS, again, those are just two of the PFAS molecules. These were designated as hazardous substances under CERCLA. And CERCLA is basically the Superfund law, right? So um, this allows EPA to use its considerable Superfund authority to start in forcing people to clean up, releases. Um, they have said in some guidance that they're really focused on, the manufacturers and the users of PFAS, and they don't think they're going to go after like wastewater treatment plants, drinking water plants, your municipal sort of entities, and airports as well. So this is happening now. EPA is actively sampling Superfund sites looking for PFAS contamination, and there are a few Superfund sites in the country now that have been listed as Superfund sites just because of PFAS. In October of last year, EPA published aquatic life ambient water quality criteria. And in December of last year, they published some draft human health aquatic water quality criteria because these chemicals end up in our, rivers, lakes, and streams. And so these criteria are designed to protect aquatic life, the fish and the plants that live in the stream. And the human health aquatic water criteria are designed to protect humans that might be using that stream either as a source of drinking water or just as a source of recreation. I mentioned the TRI rule that was passed a couple years ago. In July, at July 1 of this year, all of that information, all of the sort of manufacturing information of who is using PFAS, these companies are going to have to start notifying their downstream customers if they have knowledge of PFAS in their products, right? So if you are somebody who makes nonstick pans, right? You might not know whether your pans have PFAS in them, but whoever's supplying that Teflon to you in July of this year is going to be required to let you know that, what they're sending you has PFAS in it. And then likewise, you're going to be required to notify your downstream suppliers. So I think this year is going to be very active for the manufacturers of PFAS. We don't really expect the current administration to do a lot of rulemaking in this area. The Biden administration was very active. Again, like I said, responding to a lot of sort of public concern and public outcry about this stuff. And as you can see, they were very busy. They made a lot of rules and a lot of laws to try to control PFAS. We don't really think the Trump administration is going to do that. We think they're going to be more friendly um, to industry. But the states are still very active. So here in Pennsylvania, in November of 2021, we got our first sort of soil and groundwater cleanup standards. So essentially, these are concentration limits that you have to clean up a site to if you want to be able to use it, in an unrestricted way. So, if you are trying to turn an airport into an apartment complex or something like that, and you have PFAS in the soil, Pennsylvania has standards that, if you clean up your soil below this level, it is safe for residential use. And these standards also apply to the movement of fill or dirt, essentially, during construction or any development project. So if you're proposing to move, dirt from one site to another, you are required to do some investigation at the donor site and determine if that dirt could be contaminated based on the former use of that site. And that now incorporates PFAS, right? So we're seeing this now. Construction projects are now having to sample their dirt for PFAS, and they are finding it, again, because the standards are so low. And so, now that dirt cannot be used in an unrestricted way. It has to be essentially used as a waste. In January 2023, Pennsylvania published its own state drinking water standards for PFOA and PFOS. Those have since been supplanted by the federal drinking water standards because the federal ones are more restrictive. And, the federal drinking water standards essentially set the bar. States can be more restrictive than that, but they cannot be less restrictive than that. And in December 2023, in Pennsylvania, PFAS monitoring was added to wastewater permits, right? So if you're an industrial facility and you have a wastewater stream, depending on the type of industry that you're in, you now have to you're now going to have to start sampling for these things. There is a current proposed rule that's going through the legislature right now to adopt the federal MCLs as well as add new cleanup standards for other PFAS, right? Because at this point, we really only have cleanup standards for, I think it's 4 of the 12,000 molecules, and I think they're proposing to add another 6. So this is, again, this is kind of it's the Wild West right now. There's a lot of lawsuits happening in this space as well. There was a huge settlement from BASF for $300 million paid to public water suppliers. BASF is one of the companies that were kind of involved in the manufacturing of PFAS. A huge one from 3M last year, $10 billion, which is a substantial amount of money. So, these are class action lawsuits that is being paid to the drinking water plants, right? Because they're going to bear the brunt of against the manufacturers and also other class action lawsuits against retailers and manufacturers of products containing PFAS, as well as manufacturers of the firefighting foam that I mentioned, right? So firefighters unfortunately have been exposed to these things, and there are lawsuits related to that as well. So what can we do? The federal government and the state governments have been very busy trying to get these things under control. But if you're wondering what you at home can do, as I mentioned, the UCMR 5 rule is requiring all of the public water suppliers to start sampling their water to see if they have PFAS. And you can go and look up that data right now. If you Google EPA UCMR 5 data finder, you can go on and look up, your water company, and you can see their results. At my house, I have Aqua America. I've looked it up. There is some detections of PFAS, but it is only marginal exceedances of the standards. So, personally, I'm not super concerned about it. But that is a way to get information if you're interested in finding it. Just recognize that they're required to sample their sources of water, whether that's a well or a surface water intake. The results you see on there may not be reflective of what is coming out of your tap, but it's at least information that's available to you. If you want to, you can get your water tested. So there are lots of labs in Pennsylvania and other states that can do this analysis now. It's probably going to cost you a few $100s, maybe $300, $400, $500. But you can sample your tap water and get results from an accredited laboratory if you're interested in that. Or if perhaps you're on well water, you have your own water supply, then obviously the public water supplier data is not going to be helpful to you. Carbon treatment is an effective way of removing these things from your drinking water. So, if you have one of those carbon filters built into your fridge, or maybe you have a Brita or some kind of home treatment system, that is effective. You just have to make sure that you're, regularly changing out those carbon filters because they will break through after time. But that is a good way to give yourself some peace of mind about the water that you're drinking. At the beginning, I mentioned that, fast food containers can have a ton of this stuff. That is turning out to be a, major exposure pathway to humans. So for many reasons, you should probably be limiting your fast food intake. But this is another one. Um, and as we mentioned, these things are bioaccumulative. So I think that the states and federal government are working on fish consumption advisories for PFAS, but they haven't published any of those yet. So, just be aware that if are eating a lot of predatory fish like tuna or whatever, that might be a source of PFAS exposure. And then finally, you should try to look for PFAS-free consumer products. There are, alternatives out there now that manufacturers, will say certified PFAS-free. I think these will probably become more available in the future when these sort of TRI supplier notifications start kind of coming into effect this year. So there's more alternatives should be available, in the near future. So yeah, so that's all I have. But if anybody is interested to ask any questions, I'm happy to discuss any of it.
Thank you, Will. And again, I am so sorry that I thought Zoom bombers had left and found somebody else to bother, but sorry.
Mm.
I have a question, Will. So you were talking about, the fast food containers and these big things being big exposure pathways. Do we know, what are the biggest exposure pathways?
It looks like most people, it looks like drinking water is honestly the most prevalent one because you might not eat fast food every day or every week, but you're definitely drinking water every week. And um, so again, it's sort of that cumulative loading. Unfortunately, if you go into the UCMR5 data finder, a significant proportion of the country's drinking water supply has these chemicals in it. And that is really, now we have regulations that mandate the suppliers clean it up. And so now there is sort of a mechanism to go after these manufacturers. You saw some of those class action lawsuits. So, the public water suppliers are actively installing treatment and chasing this problem. It's going to take some time and it's going to take a lot of money. Diana?
Thank you. I'm a little bit confused. If you mentioned that the carbon fluoride bond is the strongest bond that there is, and it can't necessarily be broken except through incineration. So actually two questions. The first is, so how can carbon filters like Brita improve the quality of our home drinking water? That's number one. And my second question is about clothing and textiles. Are there any brands that have stopped using PFAS? Because I know that PFAS were used in a lot of like outdoor wear and that kind of thing.
So the carbon treatment it basically captures these molecules. You can think of it sort of like a sponge, right? So the water passes through it, but the PFAS is retained on that carbon. And then eventually the filter will be, saturated and you get rid of it and put a new one in. But it's not actually destroying the PFAS, right? So it's going to be bound up in that filter, which is then going to end up in a landfill. Hopefully the landfill is lined and that is not going to result in a source of contamination to the underlying groundwater. Landfills, they're required to do a lot of monitoring to demonstrate that their liner system is effective. So again, it's removing it from the water, but it's not destroying it. And as far as brands, I think you're correct. I think there are some brands that have transitioned away from the use of these things. I don't know off the top of my head what brands those are. These things make fantastic water repellents, right? So you mentioned, outdoor gear like Gore-Tex or other trade names. They definitely used to have PFAS in them. Whether or not they still do, I don't know. But what can be tough for some of these manufacturers is they're buying a raw material from some chemical company. They may not know whether or not that raw material has PFAS in it until these sort of supplier notification rules start to take effect. So, um, some brands are more environmentally conscious than others. I'm sure if there is an outdoor brand that has, done everything it can to transition away from PFAS, they would be marketing that, right? So I would be looking for that. I guess the one thing that I will say is that, what we've been talking about are sort of these individual molecules. By the time they are incorporated into something like a Teflon pan, right? So, I mean, maybe you've heard that PFAS are present in a Teflon pan. All of these molecules are sort of brought together to make this polymer, which generally, compared to some of these other sources, is not as worrisome because they're all sort of tightly packed together. It's when you have those free floating molecules that are dissolved in water or in some other medium, that's really when they start to bioaccumulate in your body. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I can't recommend a specific brand of clothing, but I would just be looking for, brands that are selling their goods as PFAS free. It's about all you can do at this point.
Will, you were talking about the incineration being really high temperature. Do you know if like the incineration that our trash goes to, is that type of incineration still high enough?
So that's Covanta, right down in Chester.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I don't, probably not. I think these temperatures are higher than what you would find in a normal municipal waste incinerator. Once you start looking at, hazardous waste incinerators, those are probably reaching the required temperature. And this also is an area of active research. I know EPA has a lab specifically built at Triangle Park, where they are trying to figure this out. They have their own sort of lab scale incinerator where they're looking at different reaction zones and different temperatures in the stack and trying to figure out. They're basically trying to come up with treatment technologies for air emissions, right? That's what they're trying to figure out right now. Because if you don't get the temperature high enough, you might break the molecule in half, but now you've got two more PFAS, right? And the other thing that we're seeing is once they get emitted out of the stack, because they have that polar end, they tend to come back together and form aerosols, which then persist in the atmosphere for a long time. So yeah, I couldn't tell you what the exact temperature of Covanta is, but I would guess it's probably not sufficient to completely destroy PFAS.
It sounds like it might just be spreading PFAS.
Unfortunately, yeah. They've found it in Arctic ice. They found it at the bottom of the ocean. They find it in rainwater. It's everywhere.
Well, I have a question. You mentioned most of the time you ingest it. Can
Mhm.
it be absorbed in the clothing, the textiles that have it in?
I don't know. I haven't seen any studies of that. I'm sure they're out there. Uh, I don't think that, again, in my opinion, I'm not by no means like an expert toxicologist or anything, but in my opinion, that's just I wouldn't worry too much about that exposure pathway. I'd focus on what you're putting into your body, uh, and as the primary exposure pathway. The one thing that I have seen is that, when labs or environmental people go out to collect water samples or collect soil samples, you have to be very, very careful about the clothing you're wearing, the makeup that you might have put on that day, because that causes sample contamination. We see that time and time again, especially when you're trying to measure things at such infinitesimally small levels. Any particle from your coat or your makeup, that gets into the sample can contaminate it.
Well, I think I did hear something about some of the firefighter um equipment, like apparel that was really high in PFAS,
Yeah.
possibly going through the skin. But I think it was a much higher level.
Right. And these guys, I mean, they're literally spraying the stuff out of fire hoses, right? So I'm not surprised that it gets all over them. And that, that group of individuals is highly exposed. That, that makes sense. Yeah, so it could be incorporated into the Nomex itself, their fire protecting clothing, or maybe it just gets soaked with the foam that they're working with. Uh, but yeah, it sounds like you've read studies that it can go transdermal, right? So yeah, it's bad, but at the same time, like they have to put the fire out, right? They're going to use the best tools at their disposal. So it's a really tricky situation.
Does anybody else have any questions? Well, thank you very much again. If you're interested, we have some other talks coming up, and you can register for these online at the Haverford Township Parks and Rec, as well as Haverford Climate Action .org has links. Solar for Your Home is next Wednesday. Then the Rain Garden Workshop is going to be at the Crack. Also demystifying EV ownership virtual, and then transforming your yard. Grass remover, pollinators, and native plants is in April. And also invite all of you to come out to the Earth Day at the Crack, which I believe it's a Saturday in April, not during Easter week. So I don't have it right in front of me, but please join us. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Will.
Yep.